So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, may I have your attention, please? Welcome. I mean, there is a thunderstorm coming, but hopefully not to this discussion. So, welcome in this great building of the university. I mean, the Aula Leopoldina, the original place of the Wroclaw University from 18th century. And welcome to this keynote. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Olesya Khromeychuk, who is the chair of the Ukrainian Institute in London right now, but who's actually historian, writer, and theater maker, who will guide us through the complicated issues of the war at the Ukraine right now. Szanowna koleżanko, macie słowo.
Дуже дякую. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming here tonight in spite of the thunder and the appeal of beautiful Wrocław. I really appreciate your presence here. I managed to negotiate myself out of the position of authority somewhere over there, so you can actually see me. So I hope you can see me and that you can hear me as well. And I really hope that this talk will turn into a discussion. I would like to sort of introduce a few ideas, observations of the last 6 months, and maybe propose some questions of more practical nature for us to discuss, for us as practitioners and academics to discuss. So hopefully we'll have a bit of time for that as well. But first of all, I'd like to say that it's an absolute honor for me to address the Humanities in the European Research Area Conference, discussion on humanities in crisis and crisis in humanities, to be in this absolutely fantastic building. Tell you that, I've never spoken in a hall quite so exquisitely beautiful. And thank you also for giving me this platform, but most importantly for keeping Ukraine at the center of this discussion. It's an absolute it's absolutely necessary to continue to talk about Ukraine now when Ukraine fatigue is really descending on us. And I'll talk about it a bit more in my talk. So, just over 6 months ago, Ukraine appeared on the political and perhaps most importantly, mental map of the world. It was Russia's brutal violence that placed it there. The contours of the country were traced by the enemy troops. At first, amassed in thousands, together with their equipment, they were bluffing that they had no intention to attack, much like they had done for 8 years since Russia started its aggression against Ukraine. They had claimed not to have been there when they occupied Crimea, and then again when they had started and continued the war in Donbass. Since 2014, referring to Russians as "we are not theirs," using the Russian word "nas tam nety," has become a bitter joke in Ukraine. Much of the world, however, seemed to lack a sense of humor and preferred to take the Russian claim that they were not there at face value. Or at least it preferred to pretend to believe them while they pretended not to be there. Watching thousands upon thousands of troops arrive at the Ukrainian border in late 2021 and early 2022, few could believe the Russian bluff this time. It was obvious that they were there not simply for military drills. We watched them getting ready to attack. When on the 24th of February 2022, their offensive began in the east, the south, and the north, color-coded on our TV and laptop screens in blood red, it highlighted just how vast the territory of Ukraine was. As the Russian army bit into the sovereign land of its neighboring state inch by inch, so was the world learning about Ukraine's history, culture, and people inch by inch. It turned out that this small country was actually the largest within Europe, that its population was over 40 million, and that several of these millions were being displaced by enemy shelling. It also turned out that Russophone Ukrainians were not Russians, and they didn't actually want to be liberated by the Russians who came to loot, rape, and kill. It turned out that Putin had lied to the rest of the world all along, and that his lies had informed our misconceptions about Ukraine. The journey the international community made from ignorance and indifference to admiration, and finally support of Ukraine was speedy, but in my view, it is still incomplete. A lot has changed in the way Ukraine is perceived and understood around the world over the last 6 months. But what is missing is the discussion of why this crash course in Ukrainian studies was needed in the first place. Why our knowledge of the country and the region was so poor, and how this affected the actions of our political leadership. In order to have this discussion, we need to zoom out of the map of Ukraine and zoom into the spot on the map from which each one of us has been witnessing this war. Our immediate observation, one immediate observation that we can make is that the farther away we find ourselves from the war zone, the hazier our understanding of the origins of this war is. The lack of contextual knowledge, however, is not perceived as an obstacle in the decision-making processes that are of utmost importance to the chances of Ukraine's survival as an independent state. When Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were many, from Berlin to Washington, who didn't trust Ukraine to hold its ground for more than a few days. They overestimated Russia's strength and underestimated Ukraine's resilience. That disbelief in the determination and unity of the Ukrainian people meant that the much-needed weapons and other aid arrived late. Why arm a state that will not stand, that will fall in a few days? And that more military and civilians were killed by the invading troops than would have been the case had the necessary provisions been supplied in advance, or at least promptly. The countries that have found themselves in close proximity to the war zones that has now stretched across the whole of Ukraine were the ones that were the first to receive Ukrainian refugees, the ones who declared their support for Ukrainian people's fight in defense of sovereignty most unambiguously, and who called for more support for Ukraine and tougher sanctions against Russia. It is not only the geographical proximity to the front and the realization that should the war spill over across the western border of Ukraine, they will be the first burnt by this spillage that made their resolve stronger. It is also the experience of Russian imperialism, be it of Tsarist or Soviet type, that they had in common with the Ukrainian people. Poland was partitioned in the 18th century with Russia's involvement and lost its statehood for 123 years. In the 20th century, the USSR, together with Hitler, destroyed the Second Polish Republic. And communist Poland felt the watchful eye and threatening fist of Moscow until the USSR collapsed. The Baltic states have a vivid memory of imperial Russification and Soviet occupation. No one has forgotten 1956 or 1968. Orban's Hungary perhaps serves as an exception that proves the rule. But while there are some irredentist moods in the region, on the whole, those states who have felt Russia's brotherly embrace at some point in their history know full well the potential it has to suffocate those whom it embraces. While those who are lucky to have found themselves farther west can debate how not to provoke Putin or how to let him save face, East Central Europe knows that the very existence of a democratic sovereign state is provocation enough for the aggressor to carry out his aggression. And that it's Ukraine, its independence, its territory, and its people that needs saving. So, if we are to truly change the way we understand Russia's war against Ukraine, the first thing we need to admit is a lack of knowledge on our part about what Russia actually is, rather than what we've imagined it to be based on the 19th century classics we've read about War and Peace or Crime and Punishment. The second thing we need to admit is our lack of willingness to trust those who do possess this experiential knowledge of Russian imperialism, and to make that knowledge central in informing our decisions in relation to Ukraine. I have no intention of romanticizing the solidarity in East Central Europe. While it's real and strong, it is situational. It's driven by domestic concerns, and the Kremlin is currently testing it with energy blackmail in particular. And we discussed this morning specifically one example of where we see this in Prague at the protests that we discussed earlier. What I do want to emphasize is that unlike those in Paris, Berlin, London, or Washington, those in Warsaw or Prague were not surprised to see Ukrainians defend their land with their lives. Historically, they've seen Ukrainians fierce fight for their rights and territory, including when they found themselves on the opposing sides of the state-building projects. Past wars between Ukrainians and Poles have been instrumentalized by political groups in both countries for decades and have harmed the relationship on the state level and on the level of ordinary people alike. Now, however, the understanding of Ukrainians' dedication to their statehood, their freedom and their sovereignty, the Poles have more than anyone in the region, gives them certainty that Ukraine will fight until it wins. This certainty, in turn, informs the dedication with which Poles continue to be Ukraine's most enthusiastic allies in words and deeds. This solidarity demonstrates that past wars and difficult historical memory can be, if not overcome, then at least put to one side in the face of contemporary existential threat. This unity is likely to have irreversible positive changes in how Poles and Ukrainians view each other in the future. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I would like to hear your views on this as well in the discussion. But I believe that the partnership we are witnessing today has the potential to dwarf past disputes. The old Polish slogan, later adopted elsewhere in the region, "For our freedom and yours," has been revived and has acquired a very real meaning throughout East Central Europe. Ukrainians keep emphasizing that they are fighting for their sovereignty, but also for freedom in the rest of Europe. This statement is not perceived as romantic rhetoric by Ukraine's immediate neighbors. It is perceived as a fact of this war. I live in London, and I know that people there don't have the same understanding of the war. They do not feel that Ukrainians are fighting on their behalf as people in Warsaw do. They have no knowledge of Russia as a direct threat to their livelihood. The anger over gas bills is directed at politicians in the parliament in London, and it is not necessarily linked to the Kremlin's weaponization of energy. The worries over the rising cost of living are not necessarily associated with Russia's use of grain as a weapon of war. Succumbing to war fatigue and Ukraine fatigue is not perceived as playing directly into Putin's hands. At the other end of Europe, those who know about the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine of the 1930s, are not surprised to see Russia manufacture grain crisis that can lead to another major famine. Those who are familiar with the Katyn massacre of 1940 by the NKVD are not shocked by the killing of Olenivka POWs by the Russians in July 2022. Those who have grieved their loved ones in the mass graves of Stalinist terror are not surprised by the sight of the mass graves in Irpin, Bucha, or Mariupol. Unlike in Paris or Berlin, those at the other end of Europe do not force Ukrainians to speak on the same panels with Russians, to discuss reconciliation, to shake hands. They understand why Ukrainians think it unfair that Russians fleeing their regime and Ukrainians fleeing the bombs that that regime has sent to destroy their homes and their lives are treated as victims of this war on an equal footing. They do not think Ukrainians insensitive for expressing rage, anger, or even hatred towards the nation that has claimed to be a brotherly people, but has in fact chosen to become their enemy. They know that it's insensitive not to feel outrage on behalf of those who are being targeted by this unprovoked aggression. At the other end of Europe, they know how important it is to call a spade a spade. Not a crisis, but a war. Not separatists, but Russian proxies. Not the Ukraine war, but Russia's war against Ukraine. Because language matters. Language, too, is used as a weapon of war by the Kremlin. Using the shield of neutrality in the name of responsible reporting is, in fact, irresponsible. There is nothing responsible in saying that the Russian state says that Ukrainians shell their own civilians, when we know it to be a lie. Such reporting is naive at best and outright harmful at worst. But let us return to our spot on the map, to our vantage point from which we witness the war in Ukraine. And let us for a moment pause and consider how we have viewed Ukraine, the space between Russia and us, before the 24th of February 2022. This thunder is making the talk very atmospheric, at least for me. I don't know about you. Was Ukraine always perceived as an unquestionable part of Europe? Or was it floating somewhere in the sphere of influence of Russia, in our imagination? Historically, the role Ukraine played in old Europe's imagination has been that of no more than a buffer zone. This has led it to be turned into a war zone on several occasions in the past. Over 100 years ago, in the period that is mostly known in the West as Russian Civil War, the territory of contemporary Ukraine witnessed the Ukrainian Revolution and several attempts of establishing Ukrainian statehood. This experience of independence between 1918 and 1920 was brief, but it became formative for Ukrainian national identity. The identity that was completely separate from Russia, not only in terms of cultural and linguistic difference, but also political choices, differences that exist to the present day. The existence of the Ukrainian People's Republic that emerged in that period was brief, in part because the West banked on a larger and stronger Poland, facing the new Bolshevik threat. Ukraine was subsequently divided between Poland and the USSR. It was turned into a buffer zone between Europe proper and the Red threat. The lack of statehood cost Ukrainians dearly. Stalin's man-made famine of the 1930s killed millions, and repression of any national expression resulted in mass arrests and murder of intellectual elites. Perceiving the country as something legitimately within Russia's sphere of influence meant mistrusting the voices from inside the country and trusting those that spoke from Moscow. So, for instance, Walter Duranty, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this name before, the New York Times journalist who praised Stalin's collectivization while millions were dying because of famine activated by that very collectivization and used to crush resistance to the Soviet rule in Ukraine, received the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting in 1932, at the height of the Holodomor. In spite of repeated calls, the Pulitzer Board declines to revoke the award to this day. Then came the Second World War, in which Ukraine once again found itself as a buffer zone. Bloodlands, Timothy Snyder calls it. A territory that experienced multiple occupations by the Nazis and Soviets. Conflating Russia and the USSR has meant that both the suffering of the people and the victory on the Eastern Front have been perceived in the West as Russian. It didn't matter that under 10% of Russia experienced direct occupation, while the whole of Ukraine was engulfed by the destruction of active warfare and occupations. After the Second World War, the territory that had been part of Poland and had put up fierce resistance to the Soviets was sacrificed by the Western allies to the imperialist aspirations of the Soviet Union. The plan to annex this part of Ukraine had been clear already in 1939 in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that split Europe into spheres of influence. In the 1990s, when Ukraine regained its independence and, as its people hoped, acquired the voice so necessary to be taken on for an equal and not a mere object in international discussions, the way it was perceived didn't actually change much. While the kidnapped West, famously described by Milan Kundera in the 80s, was returning to Europe proper, the now independent Ukraine existed on the mental maps of Western Europeans as a vague and poorly understood post-Soviet region, and was left firmly in the sphere of influence of Russia. When in 2014 the sphere started to spread farther and farther and bite off bits of the sovereign Ukrainian territory, what did old Europe do? It wagged its finger at Russia after the occupation of Crimea. It expressed its deep concern after the occupation of Donbass and normalized Russia's aggression by funding it through purchases of oil and gas. So once again, the largest country within Europe, in spite of being a sovereign state, was no more than a buffer zone in people's imagination. A buffer zone between our comfort and Russia's threat to disturb it. Historically, Moscow has been appeased as a threat, as a situational ally, or as a political enemy, potential enemy. And this appeasement often happened at Ukraine's expense. The most recent appeasement in 2014 enabled the aggressor to present itself as a neutral party at various pseudo-peace negotiations about the war it had started. Those who call for Russia's appeasement today must realize that the only way to exit this war before Ukrainians win it is by shutting the doors of Europe in Ukrainian people's faces, by keeping them on the outside in the buffer zone and in the war zone. It might seem counterintuitive not to appreciate calls for peace when the war is so brutal and costs so many lives. But the question we must ask ourselves now is, what sort of peace can we secure? And if we have learned anything from the last 6 months and from not initially trusting Ukrainians with their own country, it is that we must listen to what Ukrainians say about how they see peace now. For Ukrainians, there will be no peace while any part of Ukraine's territory continues to be occupied. Because occupation means persecution, torture, abductions, and killings of Ukrainian citizens. Tolerating it gives the green light to the aggressor to keep going. For Ukrainians, there will be no lasting peace without justice. And justice means holding to account the perpetrators of war crimes of all calibers, and not concerning ourselves with how to allow the main war criminal to save face. The question we should answer in the part of Europe so far unaffected directly by Russian bombs is, what sort of Russia is Europe prepared to live with? Will it tolerate a totalitarian state that disrespects the rule of law not only inside the country, but also international law? Is it prepared to do business with a state that generously funds the army, that treats the perpetration of war crimes as a method of war? A state that blackmails the poorest countries with famine? Will Europe continue to give Russian culture all the platforms it wants, while the Russian state sees its culture as one of the weapons of war? Will it cooperate with the regime that seeks and succeeds in keeping some of the leaders of democracies in its pocket and meddles in elections and democratic processes all over the world, undermining the democratic order, sowing disunity, destroying the rule of law? Will it treat as equal an aggressor that sets an example to other totalitarian states that violence, terror, and criminal behavior are all permitted tools of international relations? The part of Europe that knows Russia through historical experience and not only through great Russian culture cannot live with this sort of Russia, because this sort of Russia threatens to destroy that part of Europe as it is trying to destroy Ukraine. If Europe wants to stay united, then old Europe needs to realize that its claim to superiority does not automatically translate into knowledge. It needs to listen to those for whom this war presents an existential threat. It needs to explain to its population that while they complain about energy bills, thousands of Ukrainians have no homes to heat because the Russian army has destroyed them. It needs to make it clear that it is our common war and the cause for it is the same. It's in the Kremlin. 6 months is enough to realize that we made mistakes and to begin to correct our main misconceptions. It is not enough to dismantle the foundations on which these misconceptions were built. But without the structural change, the situational knowledge we've gained of Ukraine will disappear as soon as the war is over, if not before. How do we bring about this structural change? First of all, by ensuring that we do not have to rely on a crash course catching up with the knowledge that we lack. That knowledge has to be made available widely, accessibly, and most importantly, permanently. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, universities around the world set up fellowships and programs to accommodate Ukrainian scholars. Like in the case of ordinary citizens who opened their homes to displaced Ukrainians, these projects were truly admirable, not least because often they appeared as grassroots initiatives rather than brought into being by the management of universities. At least I'm speaking about the UK for sure. I'd like to hear experiences elsewhere in Europe. This has meant an inflow of Ukrainian scholars, often possessing not only exceptional disciplinary expertise, but also linguistic skills necessary to practice outside of the country. However, the temporary fellowships, lasting on average between 3 and 12 months, are hardly the best use for this enormous pool of talent. Another weakness of these initiatives is that they do not cater for the needs of those who chose not to leave Ukraine or could not leave it. Remember, men of conscription age are obliged to stay in Ukraine. There are also those who have various caring duties or simply prefer to stay put when the very existence of their country is at stake. Their own universities might be destroyed or in temporarily occupied territories. At the very least, many will have lost their research funding and their salaries. Not to mention the emotional trauma of seeing colleagues and students enlist in the army or become casualties of war. While there are some non-residential fellowships available to those who cannot physically benefit from them by relocating to a higher education institution outside of Ukraine, their number needs to be increased. However, the measures to address the needs of Ukrainian scholars do not solve the major problem of the lack of knowledge about Ukraine, because the major problem is ours, it's not Ukrainians. It is the problem with which I began this talk. The fact that after 3 decades of the existence of Ukraine as an independent state, and after several centuries of the existence of the Ukrainian people, we only figured out the contours of that country when it became surrounded by the Russian troops. So, how do we ensure that the crash course turns into a degree and a degree into a PhD, or better still, the sort of second nature knowledge we possess about other European states that haven't suffered from the label of a buffer zone? And these are going to be my conclusions. This is essentially some of the questions and suggestions that I'd like to set out for our discussion. The obvious answer is to set up permanent, not temporary, positions in Ukrainian history, language, culture, literature, and so on across our universities. At the moment, there is one permanent program in Ukrainian studies in the UK, at Cambridge, and another institution, UCL, where you can get a degree in Ukrainian studies. The situation in North America is a bit better, as far as I understand, but the situation in continental Western Europe, I believe, is even more dire. We need more permanent programs in Ukrainian studies. We also need to revisit East European studies and see just how East European they truly are. Many of those who have done the hard work of reassessing their programs over the last 6 months discovered that in all but name, these programs are Russian studies. And not only Russian in that Russian language, culture, and history dominate them, but also in the uncritical way that Russia has been taught, devoid of the anti-imperialist or anti-colonial lens. Such a review is needed not only for East European studies, but also departments of history, politics, modern languages, and other humanities and social sciences. I spent a decade teaching the history of East Central Europe and the USSR in a variety of British universities, and over the years, I encountered 2 modules on Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, these modules were in the 2 institutions I already mentioned above, the ones that already have existing provisions for the teaching of Ukraine. Everywhere else, Ukraine fell between the cracks, somewhere into the abyss between Russia and Europe, because buffer zones don't make it to the curriculum. Perhaps we should set up a module or maybe a whole degree or a center in buffer zone studies. Those who are going to do this review of their teaching programs and library collections to see what exactly there is on Ukraine should be prepared to find little. Even now, even 6 months after Ukraine has dominated the news and its scholars have filled European libraries in person. It is so common for students of Ukraine to come to study that country via Russia. And how else can they learn about it when the available degrees are Russia-dominated? Library connections have very few works that allow you to explore Ukraine, and language tuition is not provided. Indeed, before the full-scale invasion, students of Western institutions were often sent to Odessa and Kyiv to improve their Russian. The assumption that learning Russian in Ukraine is perfectly acceptable says something about our imperialist view of that part of the world. Those students who chose to focus on Ukraine, often having visited it after they had visited Russia, and having discovered the cultural, literary, and historical wealth of the country, had to rethink the knowledge they had gained of Ukraine in the modules they took at their home universities, as this knowledge was saturated with imperialist undertones. I've had those students in my office hours quite a lot. Growing temporary fellowships into permanent chairs would ensure that students do not have to discover Ukraine via Russia. It would also ensure that consolidation of knowledge that is being accumulated now both by those who are genuinely trying to decolonize their understanding of the region and that which is being brought by Ukrainian scholars who are displaced all over Europe now. This consolidation of knowledge outside of Ukraine should be done in parallel with building lasting connections with institutions inside Ukraine, especially those that are being destroyed by the war, as this is necessary to ensure their survival and ability to revive themselves in the future. And finally, knowledge does not just reside behind the walls of academic institutions. In fact, those walls can often serve as obstacles to accessing this knowledge. Knowledge is not just a matter of academic research and teaching. It is how we ensure security. We need to educate experts who can be truly qualified to speak about Ukraine. So the politicians and journalists turn to them and not to those who assume that their knowledge of, say, Russia qualifies them to comment on Ukraine. But we also need to educate the general public. It's no use getting frustrated when people say the Ukraine, still to this day, or they misspell the names of Ukrainian cities and misunderstand our multilingualism, especially if they themselves come from monolingual cultures. If we do not offer them ways to learn about these issues. My suggestion or potential suggestions for effective dissemination of accurate, nuanced, but also accessible knowledge is based on my work at the Ukrainian Institute London. The Institute has become a more or less unique hub of information on Ukraine because it combines academic expertise with accessible delivery. Our cooperation with higher education institutions and our status as an independent charity allows us to know the needs of the regional experts, for instance, specialists who want to fill their gaps when it comes to Ukraine, Slavists in particular, of non-specialists such as reporters or politicians with an immediate job at hand related to Ukraine, as well as members of the general public who might be hosting a Ukrainian family and who want to get their heads around the war and the country more generally. I'll give you just a couple of examples of how we do this. We do this through a variety of means, including public-facing discussions that highlight how figures, for instance, such as Olesya Khromeychuk, Fadesiekle, modernist feminist Ukrainian writer, are relevant to the European literary canon. Or we produced content projects such as 10 Things Everyone Should Know About Ukraine. These are short documentary films, very social media friendly, that tell the story of Ukraine. Or we set up writing residences. One has just been completed now called Ukraine Lab, that bring together Ukrainian and UK-based writers to exchange ideas, to educate one another through peer work and similar initiatives. The impact of accessible education and nuanced cultural diplomacy on policy, especially in times of war, cannot be overestimated. Russia spends a fortune on its soft power around the world. If we are to counter it, we should do so by ensuring that higher education and cultural institutions all over the world cooperate effectively and reinforce each other's work. Coming back to my example of my institution as an independent charity with no guaranteed core funding, we can do a lot fueled by sheer enthusiasm and dedication. However, this approach will not bring about the structural change that I was talking about earlier that is so badly needed right now. Other similar centers must come into existence all over Europe, and funding must be made available to allow such centers to plan at least a few years ahead and to ensure the longevity of their projects and also the relationships that they are building with local museums, galleries, and other mainstream institutions. Such centers should unite into international associations so they can share good practice and amplify each other's voices. And if in another 6 months' time we want to see the situational interest grow into structural change, now is the time to plant those seeds. 6 months ago, the leaders of the democratic world did not trust Ukraine to withstand the Russian attack. They did not believe in its ability to stand united and defiant. Much of this distrust originated in the lack of knowledge about this country and the perception of it that was formed through the eyes of Moscow. The lack of ability to learn about Ukraine in universities, the lack of visibility of Ukraine in museums, galleries, and bookshops, and the lack of Ukrainian voices on international platforms resulted in the lack of support, both military and financial, when this support was decisive for Ukraine's survival. Ukrainians have to live with the fact that the world discovered the shape and the size of their country after it was attacked by the Russian army. We must make peace with the fact that our defiance, accumulated by centuries of anti-imperialist struggle, became known internationally because of Russian aggression. We must accept that the international community started to take interest in our culture and history just as the Kremlin set out to destroy it. But it doesn't have to be like that anymore. Now that Ukraine is on the mental map of the world, we can work towards its staying there, not color-coded in blood red, but filled with all the diversity that this country has to offer. Thank you.
Dear Olesya, thank you very much for this important keynote and pointing out what we could have done and what we can do in the future. And yeah, and what we have done, but what we could have done more or could put more emphasis on. But now I open the discussion. We have plenty of time to discuss the things. So if you have any questions and you would like to, any comments, you are free to take them right now. Thank you very much. There is a mic here, so either you come over or we can also say it. Yep.
My name is Michael Moser. I'm from the University of Vienna, and I'm a professor of Slavic Studies. Thank you so much, Olesya, for this wonderful talk. I think you've raised a lot of very important issues of various backgrounds. One of them would be one about the academic landscape, and you mentioned our notion of Eastern Europe and how things have developed over the past years. I remember some developments in US American Slavic studies. I used to be at AAASS. It was about Slavic and East European studies, and now some 10 years ago already it was all about Eurasia. And what is the point? Yeah, it is about names, it is about terms, and well, people say it's about Eurasia, but we know the truth. It's as you said, it's Russia and Russia and Russia. And if you did something else in Slavic studies, you were already an outsider. And some Russian agents even labeled you a nationalist. Once you were into Ukrainian studies, you were a nationalist. If you were engaged in Polish studies, you had to be a Pole. Everything else would be a surprise, and you would ask, how come? It was about Russia, 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 Russia. I would agree with you. We should listen to Ukrainians and to scholars from Ukrainian studies much more carefully. And as you alluded to, I would say that we should listen to our Russian, let's say, colleagues more carefully too. Because we in Ukrainian studies and in Polish studies, I'm into Russian studies too, used to listen to them quite carefully. We are not surprised by what they are doing. We should have listened much more carefully. Yes, and you are right, we suffer from a lack of expertise. Yeah, we've got some beautiful theoretical backgrounds which would suit anytime, anywhere. But where are those people who really know something about Ukraine in particular? And we are now on the territory of beautiful, most beloved Poland. Let's be honest, where are the people who know a lot about Poland? Poland used to be Eastern Europe too, until recently. Where are the true experts on Poland? So we have to reshape our whole field, but it's not easy, because a lot of things begin with what you also mentioned, the public sphere. Let me tell you a very brief story from my plans about this summer. I plan to react to recent events by organizing a beautiful summer school of Ukrainian studies in Vienna, Austria. The concept was a traditional one. Ukrainians and Austrians should meet, learn from each other. And we found a lot of interested persons from Ukraine. But from Austria, it was 3 persons. So we had to cancel this beautiful event, unfortunately, because we are not prepared. And I don't judge those people, because what were my plans when I was 18 years old? Would I have gone out in order to study Ukraine back then? No, because Ukraine hasn't been so visible. But we've had been learned some questions, some lessons. The Orange Revolution, right? then the annexion of the Crimea, and now this war. Maybe we could get more active. Maybe we could do even more in order to develop the field, in order to live in a world with more true experts on Ukraine. And I would like to add that true experts on Ukraine know a lot about Ukraine, but also about Russia, also at least about Poland, and in the long run, about the world. But not only the large picture is the interesting one, Ukraine in particular is important too. So is Poland, by the way. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much, and my apologies, public apologies for missing your keynote tomorrow. I'll be on my way to Ukraine, so I have a good excuse, but I still feel very sorry that I won't hear your speech. You're absolutely right in your comments. I just wanted to emphasize that I do not object to studying Russia or to having Russian studies, not at all. We need Russian studies, we need to study Russian culture. What I am encouraging is a critical approach to Russian studies. You know, much like we've done with lots of other disciplines when we embrace the idea of decolonization of our curriculum. Something similar has to happen to Russian studies too. You know, we're just not used to thinking of Russia as an empire, former or current, and we need to remind ourselves that it was and it is. The other thing I wanted to say is that in terms of sort of centers for the study of Europe, not Eurasia, I mean, sort of looking at Europe, where Ukraine is hopefully included into that center. When we talk about Russia's war in Ukraine, the focus needs to shift to the focus needs to shift onto those countries that I was talking about, you know, they have experiential knowledge of Russian imperialism. We need to listen to them more. And just in general, maybe rethink European studies a little bit as well, because the example I often give them, how many of you know a lecturer in West European history or West European studies? Because I know a lot of lecturers in East European studies. And the comparison I like to give is, you know, is football and women's football. One's the norm, the other's, you know, a curiosity, something that isn't a norm. So, you know, the fact that we still relegate East European studies or East Central European studies into a category of its own that isn't at the center of European studies says something, I would say. But to finish my comment to you, Michael, I'd like to end on a more positive comment, and as to say that over the last 6 months, I've seen a lot of goodwill among my colleagues all around the world to do precisely what we've been asking them to do, advocating for, to rethink their curricula, to you know, introduce some changes and so on. It's very heartwarming, it's really encouraging, but the point I'm trying to make now is that those changes need to become structural. They need to become institutionalized, because I really worry that everything will go back to business as usual very quickly.
Any other comments, interventions? Done.
Could I ask you if, to comment on Belarus? And I'm asking for the following reason. You may have other points to make, but I'm interested in the potential motivation for the invasion of Ukraine being predicated to a certain extent on Belarus and the unsuccessful attempt to have a revolution, if you like, there, which I think motivated Putin to do something while he could secure the position there, also as obviously as a further point of invasion, if you like. The second point is really about Ukraine's giving up, if that's the way to put it, of nuclear weapons, and whether there's any reflection on the promises that were made and the decisions that were made at that time in the 1990s. On nuclear weapons and the decision by Ukraine to, and the promises that were made to Ukraine of giving up its nuclear weapons that were on its territory. Thank you.
These are extremely important questions, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not qualified to answer any of them in any sort of way as an expert. I will just give my opinion and not necessarily based on expertise. In terms of Belarus, that's such a complex question for Ukrainians to deal with at the moment, because on the one hand, I mean, so many of us supported them, the country, society, Ukrainians all over the world, the diaspora community supported the protests when they happened in Belarus and continue to support the opposition and the signs of opposition. On the other hand, it's impossible not to see Belarus as a country, as a state, as a partner in crime. Absolutely. I mean, the shelling has been launched from the territory that killed Ukrainian citizens. So it's an extremely difficult discussion that needs to be had, that is being had at least in the diaspora communities. I mean, I see a lot of Belarusians in London. We talk to one another about this, but it's a very, very difficult discussion, and I'm sure it will continue to happen. In terms of nuclear weapons, I mean, Ukraine wanted to give up nuclear weapons in 1994. Of course, seeing this example now will discourage countries from either giving up nuclear weapons that they do have or not acquiring nuclear weapons, for sure. That's not to say that that is a way forward. Not at all, of course not. But when we talk about nuclear threat, I really, really want all of us to remember that nuclear strikes and Putin pressing the big red button that we're so afraid of is not the only nuclear threat in this war. Recently, we've been talking a lot or hearing a lot of conversations about Enerhodar, about the Parisian nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. You know, we've already seen it shelled. It's occupied. People there are being tortured. People there are being held, well, kidnapped, essentially, Ukrainians who work there. And it's a disaster that's waiting to happen. And every time I bring up this question with experts, whether that's military experts or political figures who have a say in this, and I say, do you have a plan for when that happens? So far, I either don't hear any answers, or the only answer that I recently heard was, well, yes, but it is not the same plan as we would have had in response to a nuclear strike, because it's a civilian object and not an object of the military, and that really, really worries me. I think we can be all, as Europeans and as an international community, sleepwalking into another disaster worse than Chernobyl, but we don't discuss it enough.
Any other comments? Come forward, please.
Yeah, hello, Olesya. I'm Christian Noack from Amsterdam. I'm one of these East Europeanists. And yeah, I have a bit of a different question to ask. And it is about the changes that you require. And I'm 150% behind everything you said. But it's more a practical reason. And perhaps to introduce the issue that is kind of chasing me around is the question of the Russian language, right? Coming here to Wroclaw, sitting on the bus from the airport, which was the 106, not the airport shuttle, I recognize the Ukrainians here by using the Russian language, and this is not a surprise for anyone who knows about the situation, because it's the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine that are mainly under attack or occupied now. So there is this kind of the German term Vexierbild comes into the mind, right, about the status of the Russian language. And I'm totally in agreement with you that it's particularly Russian soft power attempts to sort of claim or lay an exclusive claim on the Russian language and the Russian culture as expressions of a kind of Russian identity. So back to the 19th century or even earlier. But then again, when we think about what can be practically done, I'm married to a Russian teacher in a secondary school in Germany, right? She's a German national, actually. So she's not doomed to be a Russian teacher. I'm thinking about foreign language broadcasting of the BBC, of the Deutsche Welle and others. So we have a Russian language and we have another Russian language. And perhaps we have in the future, and that would be probably, perhaps it's a naive perspective, we will have as many Russian languages as we have Englishes at the moment. And I mean, so there has been a decolonization of the English language. I'd like you to comment perhaps on the question of whether we have, perhaps in the current situation, I'm totally with you, to discard and not to talk about Russia all the time or Putin's head or whatever goes on there. But the question about, is there a chance for a survival of the Russian language and things that go with it and the way to deal with that? Starting from the question that my wife is looking now for a new partner school, and it can't be in Russia, right? To teach Russian and sort of have a school exchange. It could be in Israel, it could be in Tbilisi perhaps, can it be in Ukraine in the future? So, I mean, can we sort of give everything to, or leave it to Putin and Russian soft power? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being one of those Slavs with a lot of goodwill. I really applaud all of those colleagues. Thank you. Right, so this is a very good question about the Russian language. There are different schools of thought from, you know, let's claim Russian, Ukrainian Russian as one of Ukrainian languages to let's you know, ban everything that is humanly possible to ban in terms of publications or whatever. Neither of those are likely to succeed on you know, if you look at extremes. And I really hesitate to give my opinion to Russophone Ukrainians. I'm not. I grew up speaking Ukrainian. It's up to them to decide what they do with their own language, whether they want to continue embracing it or they give it up. I have friends in London who are from Yanakiev, Donetsk, and other places in Donbass who left a long time ago Ukraine and did not have that chance in 2004, 2014, when a lot of Ukrainians started to embrace, Russophone Ukrainians started to embrace Ukrainian language as their own and switch. They sort of missed those switches because they left the country, and their Ukrainian simply isn't really practical. And they now say to me, to my face, they say, I wish I could speak Ukrainian. I wish I didn't have to speak this language as my mother tongue because I feel uncomfortable speaking it because I associate it with aggression. So it's up to them to decide on that kind of level. But what I want to say is this. I said that I'm a Ukrainian speaker from home. I grew up speaking Ukrainian. At the same time, even though I went to school in 1991, so the time in Lviv, in totally Ukrainian city, Ukrainian region, and I grew up in a Ukrainian-speaking family. I was not being taught Russian in Lviv because the school decided to stop the tuition of Russian language at that point, that year, because that was the year of independence. I grew up bilingual, right? Still, I grew up bilingual. So there's a reason why Ukrainians, and I would say vast majority of Ukrainians, are bilingual. And the reason is Russian imperialism. It's the repression of Ukrainian language. Right? It's the fact that in the Russian Empire, publication of Ukrainian literary text was banned because literary language supports the development of national identity. It's the fact that in the Soviet Union, if you spoke Russian, you had better chances of bettering your career. So why wouldn't you switch to language, especially if you're comfortable with it anyway? Because, you know, Ukrainians was perceived as backward and was perceived as, you know, not cool and so on, and also threatening. It was perceived as threatening because it was linked to understanding of the national identity. So I would say, what can we practically do? I think practically we don't need to worry about the survival of Ukrainian version of Russian language. It's going to survive. I don't think we need to worry about it. We've got Gogol to make sure that it survives, right? Still to this day, a lot of people don't realize, you know, that just how much Ukrainian there is in Gogol. You know, the dialogues that he has in his Ukrainian tales and so on. And of course, there are still Russophone writers like Andrei Kurkov who continue to write in Russian and who are the biggest patriots you can imagine of Ukraine and who are, you know, whose work is completely banned in Russia. So the Ukrainian version of Russian will survive. I think what we do need to worry about is how we ensure that Ukrainian survives, that Ukrainian is funded enough to keep producing this fantastic content that is producing in the moment. One of the main things that I think encouraged people to switch from Russian to Ukrainian, those who were Russophone, is not even the political changes, Maidan and so on, is the quality of popular content. Blockbusters dubbed into good Ukrainian, cartoons for children dubbed into good Ukrainian, excellent, I don't know, popular music coming out in the Ukrainian language. It became cool. And to stay cool, it needs funding. And it needs our support and it needs our consumption.
Any other? Yeah. Michael. Yep.
so sorry, it's the second time, but this is my field of expertise, and the question you raised. What I would like to mention is that this idea of creating a Ukrainian standard of Russian, a Belarusian standard of Russian, and so on and so forth, is the idea of Western intellectuals. I've never heard anything similar from people in Ukraine. People in Ukraine, when they insist on their right to speak Russian, usually say, "Мы хотим говорить на языке Пушкина." We want to speak in the language of Pushkin, which they of course can't do, and that's it. But this idea has been raised by many people, and I think this is maybe not so easy for many reasons. One of the reasons is the origin of the Russian standard language and its history. It's a highly centralized language. It's a highly artificial language from the outset, and it has become so artificial in the course of time that there are many experts who say that Russian has no dialects, and they are even proud of this. You know, they are even proud of having no dialects in Russian. Of course, it's not true, because you have large books on Russian dialects and so on and so forth. But Russian has a history of distinguishing people by accents. One has a good accent, one has a bad accent. Of course, one could do it, but I personally, since I'm a linguist and since I'm a person who is sometimes asked questions like this, I wouldn't recommend to make this step. We have much more problems in Ukraine in keeping alive Ukrainian. And we have to be much more aware of the so-called Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, because the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine are very often basically Russian-speaking cities of Ukraine. The areas around the cities are not so Russophone after all. And, you know, why do we have no Ukrainophone schools in the Russian Federation, by the way? Well, Russians tell us that's not necessary, because Russian and Ukrainian are so similar after all. Ukrainians can learn Russian very easily. Yeah.
No, I understand. And actually, on your point, Michael, if you allow me, I just wanted to, I remembered one other thing, you know, that I'd like to say to people who worry about the survival of Russian language in Ukraine. I mean, I understand why people think that, you know, okay, things are changing, is listen to the language that is used in the army. You know, what language does the army speak? The army that is facing the Russian troops. I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard the phrase early on in this invasion, full-scale invasion, said by the Ukrainian sailors on Snake Island, that became a slogan of Ukrainian defiance, is basically telling the Russian warship where to go. And it was in Russian. And the lovely thing about that becoming a slogan of defiance is that while it is still in Russian, it is spelled in Ukrainian letters. And I just kind of like that a lot, about, you know, the hybridization of languages that happen in Ukraine. And let's not forget that Ukraine is not just a bilingual country, it's a multilingual country. Crimean Tatar is spoken, Hungarian, Polish. Yiddish to this day is still an extremely prominent language, at least of literature, that originates from Ukraine and so on. And this is the legacy to embrace and to celebrate. Definitely one thing to do is to resist weaponization of it by the Kremlin.
Yeah, just one sentence, because you didn't interrupt, you intervened. One last sentence. We have to think about what people discuss in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, people are very strong in favor of supporting the Ukrainian language. That's it. And, you know, the creation of a Ukrainian standard of Russian is not just an idea, it's also about funding and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. any other intervention, or we have still some couple of minutes, but yeah, I mean, we don't want to get into the linguistic discussion.
No, I'm not a linguist, and I sort of very much sort of appreciate all the knowledge that Michael Moses brings into the discussion, and I know his books. But that was not my point. My point was a very pragmatic one. We, particularly in the global world, have a global Russian now, which is partly institutionalized, partly not. And it's the closest thing to open up knowledge. And people can't, I mean, sort of we at the universities struggle to sort of replace, let's say, Russian as the entry to East Slavic studies or something else easily, although that can be done. But if you're sort of a state-paid teacher in a system and you get your diploma for a certain language, you don't start teaching Ukrainian the next day. So it's really about the pragmatism. Can we do something with Russia which is not kind of playing into Putin's hands? That was my point. I'm not discussing sort of what needs to be done for the Russian language in Ukraine or anyone. It's, anywhere else. It's rather this question of what can we do, right? Sort of, and how can we perhaps still use the skills and the institutions that we have to use it differently? That was my point. That is all. Thank you.
Look, I'm not going to pretend that I know the solutions to these difficult things. I just want to say that, you know, if you want change to start happening, it needs to start happening. And yes, it's not going to be easy at first. If you want to introduce it without, say, being able to hire Ukraine specialists or make those shifts that I was talking about earlier, so actually embracing the region as the region and not via Russia constantly, but you still want to do something quickly and you want to do an immediate with the resources that you have, teach Kurkov. Teach Gogol Ukrainian stories and not St. Petersburg only. Explain his dvoyedushiye and, you know, his double soul identity. Explain the effects of Russian imperialism. You need the Russian language for all of this, right? And this is what I mean. Like, I don't propagate destroying Russian studies whatsoever. I simply encourage to embrace the kind of, you know, anti-imperialist position when we come to study it. And for that, you need the language. You know, you absolutely need the Russian language and you need those expertise, totally. But rather than being enchanted by the great mysterious Russian soul, let's, you know, let's debunk it.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? I mean, we have the concert in 20 minutes downstairs, and then on the boat, during the dinner, we might continue with all these difficult questions in completely different environment. So if there are not any immediate questions or comments or interventions, then I thank very much, Olesya, once again for this wonderful introducing the complex problem of the war in the Ukraine right now. And I invite you to the concert, which will be at the Oratorium Marianum, which is downstairs, one of the most beautiful concert halls in 18th century Europe, actually. So thank you very much.